Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Do you all remember the video I made in fall? Specifically, the one that was released on the 20th of September 2025. It was titled, Taking a Risk on Broken Gear. Do you remember it? I do. Kind of. At any rate, I finally finished the repair on the Panasonic GH2. Took me a while. To refresh your memory, the GH2 was a camera that I bought that was sold as broken. I paid 40 Canadian dollars for it, and it even came with a lens. And I figured the lens on its own was worth at least $40. So, there you go. My rationalization to spend money was done. Therefore, I purchased it. And I also just wanted to try the GH2 in general because it was, I believe, the first 16 megapixel micro four thirds camera. At any rate, what we learned was that it mainly actually had a dead battery, and the pop-up flash lever was missing. So I printed a new one, and now it does that. Additionally, the back of the camera had a loosey-goosey LCD, and the hinge cover was cracked, so I glued that back together. Now, the thing was, when I got the camera, I had more or less let it sit after I'd done a bunch of smaller repairs, like this and gluing up the cover on the hinge. For some reason, I did not fix the loose display hinge. That was the last thing that I had to do, and it took me months to do, apparently. Actually, that's a lie. It took me around 15 minutes, but I, for some reason, didn't do this repair until March of 2026. So, that is a couple months to do this. But now, the hinge is good to go, and it is not so floppy. It's just the regular amount of flippity floppity, not excessively so. And with the camera as repaired as I can get it, without spending any more bucks, I figured now is the time to actually do a review of what I think is a bit of an important but slightly forgotten model in the Micro Four Thirds lineup. So, with that, let's dive in. What is the GH2? Well, the Panasonic GH2 is a Micro Four Thirds camera. It was released in October of 2012, and it's a little bit unique because it features Panasonic's first 16 megapixel live MOS sensor. It's right there. And if you didn't figure it out, it's Micro Four Thirds, so it's a 2x crop vector. But not only that, it is one of the few multi-aspect sensors that Panasonic used. So this camera actually has 18 megapixels worth of photo sites, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But moving on, the GH2 has an ISO range of 160 to 12,800. The shutter speed is good from 60 seconds to 1/4000th of a second, with flash sync at 1/160th a second. The camera can handle continuous shooting at 5 FPS for 7 RAWs, or 40 FPS if you're okay with using smaller 4 megapixel images. Autofocus on this camera is contrast detect only, but does work for photo and video mode, which is good because cameras of this era didn't always do that. The camera also has a built-in flash. And guess what? Panasonic actually gives you the GN value of the flash. Of course, it's at ISO 200 because the base of this one is 160, and I guess 200 is a nice round number. Anyways, the GN value at ISO 200 is 15.6. Thanks, Panasonic. And I believe that's in meters also. So ISO 200, 15.6 GN value in meters. Awesome possum. The GH2 features a 3-inch tilty flippy touchy screen. Uh-oh, I triggered the 10-second timer. Time to turn it off. At any rate, the touch panel is actually an older style. It's not multi-touch. It's an older single-touch resistive panel. And the screen itself is 460 K dots. But you do know that it has an EVF as well, right? And that is 1.53 million dots. And it uses field sequential panel technology. Anyways, it's one of the older, weirder display types. And memory cards on this are SD cards. And it uses a DMW BLC12 battery. Lovely name. And with the battery, this camera comes in at 442 grams. When it was new in 2012, it was 1100 USD, or 1565 in 2026 turbo dollars, or 2126 in Maple Goose turbo dollars. Okay, let's discuss the floppy screen repair. Since I didn't talk about it in my broken gear video, I just wanted to show you how I went about repairing the screeny screen. Since when doing some research about this camera, it turns out there's a bit of an issue with Panasonic hinges of this era just getting loose, which is weird. Now, in my case with my GH2, I am 90% certain the hinge on this wasn't loose due to wear over time, but probably because this camera was very well used and got knocked around pretty aggressively quite a bit. Since when you look at the back of this display, there are some signs of damage, and as I mentioned earlier, I did have to glue together a cracked hinge cover, which is underneath here. However, the issue with the loose display was otherwise the same, and effectively it boils down to the hinge screws in here simply getting loose, whether or not it is through them working themselves free over time or through many violent bashes, as is likely the case with mine. At any rate, the fix is actually pretty easy, and it is worth doing if you do have one of the Panasonics with a loose display. And it apparently does affect other Panasonic models too, but disassembly and attacking the issue is broadly the same. For this repair though, I did partly use the Life Pixel guide on the GH2, which is the guide that's normally used if you're going to convert your camera to infrared. Obviously, we're not doing that here. I just want to use the guide because it gives you detailed instructions on how to get or how to tear down the camera. And we basically just need to get to the point where we are at the point where you want to remove, or where you're able to remove the rear panel of the camera. That's all we want to do looking at the Life Pixel guide. I'll put the step on screen for where to actually stop at, because you don't need to take it apart any further than that. And you also don't need to disconnect the ribbon cables that connect the panel. But if you are concerned with stressing the cables up, or theoretically maybe applying too much force and tearing them off, then feel free to disconnect the cables so you can remove the assembly altogether and have a little more wiggle room when working on the hinge without worrying about things dangling. I honestly just maneuvered the rear panel with the cables connected, and then I removed the 2 screws as indicated. And again, I'll be popping photos up here or there. Sorry about the cut. I forgot to include this next step in the video, so we're doing it now. From this point, you remove the black hinge covers as indicated by the yellow. All right, now we're back to the video. And then I just tighten the 2 screws that are also indicated. Again, photos there or there, maybe here, but probably here. And honestly, that's it. It was literally just 2 screws. And once you tighten those, the display should no longer be wobbly, and you can reverse the instructions and reassemble. Multi-aspect what? Let's talk about this sensor. So it is a bit of an interesting one. In the lineup of Panasonic cameras, there were some cameras that they equipped with what they called the multi-aspect sensor. Effectively, it is a slightly bigger than normal micro four thirds sensor. The normal micro four thirds sensor comes in at 17.3 millimeters by 13.0, just 13 millimeters, where the multi-aspect sensor came in at 19.3 millimeters by 13.4. And what it ends up accomplishing is that if you're shooting the normal 4/3 shooting ratio, you get a normal 4/3 image output. But if you decided that you want to change the aspect ratio of your shot, say to 3:2 or to 16:9, the sensor will be able to change the pixels it's using via the multi-aspect bits, and you will still get a 2x crop field of view instead of cropping in like you would need to do on a regular micro four thirds camera. And this is a pretty neat feature, but here's the thing. Is it important? Was it impactful? It turns out, for most people, no. And the sensor size was really only used, or the idea of it was really only used in a handful of cameras. The GH2, the LX100, the GH5S, and the GH1. There might be another one, but I don't honestly remember. And I am actually in the camp of it's not that important. I personally, in my mind, don't really mind one way or another, whether or not the thing crops in or not if I change aspect ratios. Mainly because I'm not really going to change aspect ratios. But I do appreciate it's a neat idea, and it just didn't really stick around. Operation and feel. The GH2 is a camera that I think was made before Panasonic kind of found itself. And it's not that this camera is bad, but it does feel rough compared to what you get from Panasonic now. We do gotta remember, this was made in the era when mirrorless cameras were still getting their footing. Olympus, at this point, were leveraging their smaller size EP and EPL series cameras, and they were about a year away from releasing the gorgeousness that is the EM5. When it came to Panasonic, the design language that you get from them is more shrunken down DSLR, and it kind of shows. The GH2 just does look like if you took a DSLR and in every direction shrunk it. You got your finder hump right here. You got a pretty reasonable grippy grip right here. And overall, ergonomically, they're reasonably good. For me, I like the fact that the grip itself is reasonably nicely rubberized, and I think the size-wise, it is fairly fine. It works. Now, my hands, I think, might be about the limit for the limit for what can comfortably fit on this camera. If you got someone with much bigger hands, this will probably feel a bit too small. But luckily, on the back of the camera, you do also get a thumb rest here, and that does help. Additionally, the build overall of the GH2 does feel plasticky in the cheap sense. Not like a denser, heavier plastic. Not like when Canon did the 60 with its blend of polycarbonate and magnesium or whatever. This just feels like cheaper materials. So it doesn't feel like a very premium camera, if that makes sense. But otherwise, it's all right. When it comes to controls, the GH2 has a pretty solid amount of dedicated controls, like you would on a DSLR. I'm generally a fan. And the one command dial here also pushes in, which is neat. And this camera has a lot of stacked mode dials, for example, or stacked dials. You have your mode dial here, which you can change your modes, but you also have your drive mode there, so you can select what you want. And another layer, you got your power button here, or power switch. That's great. And these controls, I find, are fairly intuitive and can be operated with either your thumb or index finger to change their respective control. And you can then just pinch your mode dial and get on with it without having to use your other hand. So it is overall really pretty well thought out. On the left side, you also get a stacked dial. You have your focus modes and your actual manual focus, continuous, or single. So overall, a nice variety of dedicated things. Now, you also get some custom function buttons here, but it's not like a modern camera where you can set absolutely everything. And lastly, aside from the shutter, you do have your video record button right there. On the back of the camera, you also get more sensible controls. All the things you need to navigate the menu through playback, and a lot of stuff, or all of the stuff, is on this side, on your right. It's great. With the only thing on the left really being your EVF LCD toggle right here. And really, I'm just going to leave it alone since I use the automatic switchy deal. One thing you might have noticed is I didn't talk about command dials too much, and this is where this camera does fall a tiny bit short. You do get the one and only one, and it's on the back. And like I said, it does click in, so that's nice, but really, I think given the styling of the camera, it's supposed to be a mini DSLR, it really could have done with two. Although I am a little glad that they didn't jam one of the multifunction dial pad command dial thingies here and instead just went straight for a traditional D-pad layout. I actually just like those a little more most of the time. That being said, there are overall more than enough dedicated controls, and because of that, I'm kind of okay with not having a second command dial. Kind of. If you remember when I talked about the specs several minutes ago, I mentioned that this has a touchscreen, resistive, 1 point. And credit where credit is due. For a resistive panel, it's not bad. It's pretty accurate. It is actually pretty solid for dragging things around. And overall, it actually feels okay for a single touch panel. But really, by the time this camera came out, it shouldn't have been a thing. It should have been a multi-touch panel. But Panasonic is weird, and for some reason, they continue to use the single touch panel for some other cameras as well, like on the GF3. And there's a review out there that said it best. The nicest thing about the touchscreen is that you don't have to use it. But again, as I said, for a resistive touch layout, it's probably as good as you're going to get. I don't think I can really manipulate. Oh, there, I'm going to try to do it looking at the phone that I use to do my remote shooting. And let's see if I can go up there and switch to another setting. There. So yeah, good for what it is, but not that good. Along with the fact that it is a single touch panel, the touchscreen doesn't do everything. It's not like modern cameras where you can navigate basically the entire camera with the touchscreen. You can do some things. You can access things that are on your Q menu, you can move your focus point, you can do tap to shoot, but you can't navigate the menu. And honestly, it kind of feels odd with this camera because some of the iconography and some of the other text and typefaces of this menu system are pretty chunky and look like they'd actually be pretty solid touch elements, but they are not. The one place where I do find the touch panel a little bit useful is image review. The navigation for image review for single touch is pretty solid. Let's see if I can pull up an image. All right, so here we go. And you can double tap to punch in, which is what I did. And again, you can drag around the image with your single touch point. And like I said, it is surprisingly good, pretty responsive, and overall, again, for a single touch panel, not bad. I'm going to say that a lot, but maybe I'll stop now. At any rate, let's talk about menus. They aren't bad. They are basic, easy to decipher, and well labeled, as well as being color coded. You can see as I scroll through, the main text or the text on the top left for what part of the menu you're in changes colors. Awesome. Good stuff. No notes. The EVF is, as I said, a field sequential panel. And it's kind of weird. This is one of those things that got high praise when it was released, but now it gets poo-pooed a lot. Sure, in terms of resolution, this panel is considered low, but by no means does that mean it is unusable. I generally don't have any issues with this finder, either in resolution or in some of the other weird things people complain about when they talk about these older field sequential EVFs. The primary one being color tearing under certain conditions, like if you're panning over parallel lines, or for some reason you're darting your eyes all around the finder. I don't do the darting thing. And sure, once in a while you might notice a weird artifact doing some things when if you are photographing fine vertical line patterns. But I never got turbo bothered by it. But who knows? Maybe I just don't care enough about that stuff. But does anyone here watching this actually loathe this style of EVF on these older Panasonics? Let me know. And let me know if it is because of the weird artifacts or if there's just something else that I'm missing about it. And basically, to sum this part up, yes, in 2026, the field sequential panel is still perfectly serviceable. When I use the GH2, I tend to shoot a mix of micro four thirds AF glass and manual focus glass. And the one thing that this actually doesn't have, despite being a mirrorless camera, is focus peaking. But you do get punch in. So that is something that I am legitimately a little bit annoyed at. That is, I think, a pretty legit complaint. More so than the EVF thing. And it's unfortunate. Now, let's talk about that rear panel. As I mentioned, 460 K dots. This to me is a little low. Even at the time when this camera was new, that was a low-ish number. Again, that is not to say that it is useless, but honestly, it's not ideal given that this camera does feature a otherwise pretty solid tilty flippy mechanism. But on the other side, the tilty flippy bits sometimes helps me forget that the panel is such a low dot count. So, you give and take. Image quality and autofocus. Before we get into this, I do want to talk about the sensor a little more. This is the 16 megapixel granddaddy, if you will. As I mentioned, the GH2 is the first Micro Four Thirds camera to break past 12 megapixels. And in a pretty big way, 16 is a 33% boost in pixel count. And that's not nothing. And this would become the standard pixel count for Micro Four Thirds for seemingly forever, until that 20 megapixel sensor made its way into a couple of cameras, and that 25 megapixel one I think is only in 1 or 2 Micro Four Thirds cameras. So yeah, this had a very long run. This pixel count had a very long run. And this sensor would see several variations and many improvements as they developed this 16 megapixel. What I'm saying is that Panasonic and Olympus fielded a ton of different 16 megapixel chips, and I find that pretty interesting. Anyways, the GH2. For this, we do have to remember this is a fairly old Micro Four Thirds camera. Currently, we are in the era of the GH7. This is a 2. That's a lot of generations in between. So this does mean you do have to temper your expectations a little bit. If you're used to modern Micro Four Thirds cameras like the GH7 or the G9 II or your M43's, those cameras have some pretty incredible advancements. And yeah, it's kind of crazy because if you look at those cameras, in terms of just technical specs, those get pretty close in terms of noise and dynamic range to some older generation full frame cameras. That's a crazy thing. The GH2 is not there, but it is the stepping stone for those cameras. And if you're into charts, you can have a look at photon to pixels, and you can see that the GH2 is one of the cameras where we start to see Micro Four Thirds technical figures start to really get better, get good. It leapt over the 12 megapixel sensors of old. But again, nowadays, the GH2, it's considered a bit of a noisy camera. The dynamic range is what you would call very Micro Four Thirds-y. It's limited, but that's okay. It just means you need to be a little more careful pushing and pulling files. And since the GH2 doesn't have IBIS, you can't compensate with longer shutter speeds at lower ISOs, like you could with some Olympus cameras or newer Panasonic ones. And this camera is in the era prior to the removal of AA filters. So this one does have one, meaning that per pixel sharpness will take a hit. Now, let's have a look at some noise samples. Looking at the samples, I'm actually pretty happy shooting this camera at around 1600 ISO. Even at 3200, I think that there's enough detail in the image that running it through normal non-AI noise reduction would get you a pretty solid usable file. But after that, from anything above 3200, for me, I find there's just a little too much detail lost for me to really want to use those ISOs, other than in extreme situations. But I'm a very casual shooter, so very unlikely that I'll be in those. When it comes to autofocus, this was also a bit of a pleasant surprise. Honestly, for a camera from 2012, this thing still rocks for single point AF. Yes, today we do have 100,000 point hybrid AF systems that have super duper toe tracking, but that's okay. This camera is still fine. It has a contrast detect only system, and it works pretty well. And you do gotta remember, Panasonic got into the hybrid phase detect stuff really late. I think they were last to the game. And that's kind of fine. To be honest, I kind of get it. When you look at the performance of the single point AF on the GH2, it was pretty snappy. It wasn't as good as those cameras equipped with depth from defocus like the GH4, but again, it's pretty fast, it's very accurate, and on static subjects, I don't have any issues using it. Now, this camera also actually has some face detection options, but I personally don't think they work super well most of the time. It does paint a box over a face, and it sometimes will do it, but it is quite rudimentary compared to the modern systems today that can prioritize left eye, right eye, or whatever. When it comes to tracking performance on the GH2, that's where this camera does feel inadequate. Being contrast detect only did not help in this case. The system doesn't do a great job with moving objects, whether they're just moving towards you or if they're moving weird and irregularly. You can see when you use the AFC, the tracking mode, that the camera does tend to do quite a bit of pulsing, which is not great. And if you're planning to do action or fast moving subjects, the AF system on this camera probably won't cut it. I'm not really going to pop up that many samples of it, but needless to say, when I was doing a fairly easy test where I would shoot a static object and just lean myself back and forth in a burst of 6 shots, I think 1 was in focus, and that might have been a fluke. And it didn't seem to matter whether or not I was using the center tracking circle or tracking square, or if I had the target tracking option on. It just wasn't really good at keeping it in focus. But that's honestly kind of fine, because this camera is not a speed demon anyways. Let's have a listen to this not a demon. There you go. Now, it's actually not terribly slow at 5 FPS, which was not bad for the time, but it ain't super quick. And for me, the shutter noise, now the GH2 isn't actually that slow, coming in at 5 FPS, which for the time wasn't bad. For now, yes, it's kind of slow. And when it comes to the sound of the shutter, I find it just alright. To me, the pitch is a bit too high, and honestly, it's kind of loud, but not in a way that I like. And with that, let's have a look at some sample images. Video mode. For any serious motion photo people or cineographers or whatever you want to be called, you might want to just skip this section. I'm just going to give a quick blurb about the video out of the GH2 before we head into the sample video gallery. For this segment, I actually initially intended to explore the P-Tools firmware mod stuff and try to get some high bitrate video out. But at the time of recording, which is March 2026, the forum of the P-Tools site is down, and that's no fun because the forum is where all the presets were that would have enabled me to kind of just plop in a firmware. So I'm at a bit of a loss. If anyone has one of these custom firmwares done up or knows what settings I need to do on P-Tools to get some nice bits of rates, let me know and we may revisit this. But with that said, we're just going to discuss the GH2 bone stock. Now this camera does do video at 1080p, but it's not like a 200 megabit codec or anything. It's 23. And that being said, for 1080p footage, for me, I think it looks pretty sharp and overall fairly nice. The only real issue is that this camera doesn't have IBIS, so you can't really be doing handheld stuff unless you have like a stabilized lens with optical stabilization. Another annoying thing is the audio. The camera only has a 2.5 millimeter audio jack, so if you want to plug in a normal 3.5, you need an adapter, which is a little annoying. For the talking head video that you are about to see, I just used the onboard mic. Now, one thing that actually did surprise me though was autofocus. It was actually pretty nice, I think. Now, this surprised me because my thoughts of the autofocus in continuous mode in stills mode was not great. So I was a bit worried about how it would go for video. But generally, when it comes to the GH2, at least doing a talking head video where the setup was fairly simple, I think it actually did fairly nice. I thought it would be more jittery and I thought it might not lock on as well as it did. Now, I'm also not basing this opinion off nothing. Remember when I did the GH4 review? Yeah, I own a GH4, I still have it. That camera, to me, in a talking headshot, did more pulsing. Sure, it did find my eyes and my face better, but I do remember seeing more jitters. Although that might have honestly been me using or not properly setting it up. We're not setting it up as well. But on the GH2, there aren't that many things to set. So it was a nice surprise when it just kind of mostly worked. So yeah, the GH2 I found was pleasant for video. The focus on it when it was tracking my face actually racked nice and slow. So the poles look kind of nice, kind of natural-ish. And it would do this for the most part in a predictable way. Yes, sometimes it would go back and forth a bit because it is contrast detect, so it's not very depth of wear, but it wasn't as jittery as I thought it would be. Now, I do want to mention for the video, I didn't intentionally try to do too much moving to trick the video AF or anything. The only really thing I did really to give it a test was to partially obscure my face to see how it would handle that. And yes, it did at times start trying to figure out where my face went. But overall, if my head was entirely in the frame and there wasn't anything obscuring it, it tended to do a solid job. Now let's have a look at that actual clip and the other ones. Hello. We are now recording a video on the GH2. We're using the onboard mic. I'm just in the 24p cinema mode. And when it comes to color profiles, I'm just using the neutral one. So it should look neutral. Now, we are equipped with the 25mm f1.7, nothing super crazy, and I just wanted to have a look at how this camera does in autofocus in video. And I'm also using right now the face detect mode, and it seems for this kind of shot where the head is mostly straight on with a little bit of turning, we are actually doing all right. From the LCD, it looks like it's mostly got me. Now, I will say, if I do this, it loses me for a bit. But I'm back. And if you do extreme angles and you're moving, I don't know why you'd be doing this, but if you're, it will sometimes lose you. But this is honestly a little better than I thought it was going to do, considering the photo mode tracking AF tended to be quite a bit pulsier. I'm not sure, maybe that's still pulsy. I'm only able to judge this based on what I'm seeing on the rear LCD, but I will report what I see, hopefully in the segment just prior to this one. All right, that's all for this sample video from the GH2. Almost all, my bad. So this camera doesn't have IBIS, so obviously I'm recording this on a tripod. Now, one way you could get around it if you did want to use this for video is if you bought a Panasonic lens with OIS. I do have one, but I'm not using it. It's the kit lens, and I don't really care for that. But that's one way to get around if you do want to do some video on this thing and you don't have a tripod. But otherwise, fixing it in place via tripod, probably not a bad idea. All right, now I'm going to actually get the footage off the camera and we'll see what this actually looks like. Recommendation and conclusion. As is tradition, we'll start with price. The camera has been selling for pretty cheap as of the time of this recording, 2026, about springish. And looking at your E of bays, you can see that a bunch of these have sold kind of recently for as low as 80 USD. And these are working units. And some more pristine cameras have been going for around 200 USD. But I think overall the average sits somewhere at around 140 US dollars, which is not bad. And if you're someone that doesn't like doing the online auction sites and would prefer to go to a used camera shoppy, I'm seeing prices around 200 USD. Honestly, I find this to be quite cheap. And yes, it's old. But if you look at a camera that is pretty similar in age and is the competitor to the GH2, the EM5, the EM5 is significantly more pricey than the GH2. Admittedly, this is a very pretty camera, so I kind of get it, but you shouldn't discount this because you will save quite a bit of money. As a stills camera, I'm overall pretty happy with the GH2. The image quality is still solid. The AF is pretty fast for static objects. I do wish the build were a bit nicer, but again, at the price point, it's a compromise that I'd be willing to take. The main light just went out. Excuse me while I go swap that battery pack. As a stills camera, I'm honestly very happy with the GH2. Its image quality is still pretty good. AF is fast enough for me and for what I like to shoot. And really the only thing I do wish for is the build quality of the GH2. I wish that the materials were a bit nicer. But at this price point, I think it's a compromise I'd be willing to take if I were looking for a camera on a budget. And if you are looking for a camera on a very tight budget, this is a very budget-friendly camera. And it's very, very overall usable. It's a good way to get into Micro Four Thirds or mirrorless in general. And I think it's a pretty easy recommendation for someone looking for a camera on a budget. I had lots of fun shooting with this camera. And again, one of the other things that I want or would really have liked to have seen on it would have been focus peaking. So between that and build quality, there aren't a huge amount of cons to having one of these. But when it comes to manual focus stuff, you still do get punch and zoom. So you're not left in the lurch. And if you're not planning to get into any manual focus, then honestly, it's not really even worth bringing up. Now, one last thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap things up is that the battery pack on the GH2 is one of the ones that has third-party variants that have integrated USB-C ports. Look at this right here. This one's my newer. And if you saw my other video on batteries, you know I love these. Very convenient. So that's another plus for the GH2. And with that, let's wrap it up. And here's what I want to know. Does anyone else remember these really early Micro Four Thirds days? Do you remember the EP1? Do you remember this GH2? What about the Sony Nex cameras, the original ones? I'm not gonna lie, those times for me were pretty exciting. There are lots of things shaking up the industry, and you know, Olympus was Olympus still at the time. And I was legitimately super excited for the EP1. I actually bought one pretty shortly after the release and had quite a bit of fun with it. Don't have it anymore, unfortunately, but that's all right. That's just how it goes. And lastly, if anyone does have any questions about the repairs done on the GH4 or wants any tips, let me know and I'll see if I can get back to you with my thoughts. I'll also post a link to the little flash switch that I 3D printed if this issue somehow also happened to your camera. Otherwise, with that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, or maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.